By 1985, Nintendo's now 2-year-old home console, the Famicom, had proved to be a runaway success, establishing an install base that continued to grow at an exponential rate. As the console's adoption rate quickly increased, so too did demand for new software and more in-depth experiences. Famicom cartridges weren't exactly fast or cheap to manufacture at this time, so Nintendo looked to the PC market for inspiration on a more cost-effective and easier-to-produce type of media format, the floppy disk. The company would develop the Famicom Disk System, a hardware add-on for the Famicom that would help not only bring down software costs for Nintendo and their customers, but also introduce expanded options and features for game developers. These floppy disks, referred to as disk cards, provided more storage space for development studios to work with than cartridges, allowing for larger sprites, more impressive graphics, and animations that at this point had been reserved only for PC games. Disc cards also offered save functionality to let players continue their adventures at a later time, and provided games with one additional audio channel for sound designers to create more detailed music and sound effects. The Famicom Disk System launched in Japan during February of 1986, alongside the revolutionary action-adventure game titled The Hyrule Fantasy Densetsu no Zelda, or simply The Legend of Zelda in the West. The additional memory provided by the disc cards allowed Shigeru Miyamoto and his R&D4 team to craft a massive world for players to explore, filled with dungeons to conquer, treasures to claim, and secrets to uncover. This new revolutionary experience helped sell Japanese consumers on the add-on, leading to hundreds of thousands of Famicom disk systems sold within its first month. Around this time, another revolutionary game entered development under the watchful eye of gaming visionary Gunpei Yokoi and his R&D1 team. This project would be known as Space Hunter for much of its development, before eventually receiving its final title, Metroid. Similar to The Legend of Zelda, it had a focus on exploration and utilized the additional memory and functionality of the disc cards to provide players with an expansive world filled with branching paths and countless hidden secrets, as well as the ability to save their progress on the disc and continue their journey on the planet Zebes later, even after turning off their Famicom. Towards the end of Metroid's development, a newly hired employee of Nintendo R&D1 named Toru Osawa was given the opportunity to begin designing a new game for the disk system on his own, as the rest of the team were frantically scrambling to finish Samus's debut adventure. On this new project, Osawa spent countless hours single-handedly writing up the entirety of its design documents, creating all of its artwork, and combining everything into a cohesive experience. Intelligent Systems, a studio that would continue working closely with Nintendo for decades to come on franchises like Fire Emblem and Paper Mario, assisted in programming the project, with Tosei Software presumably helping with game testing later as well. Osawa's love of Greek mythology manifested into both the game's characters and its setting, with it eventually being titled Hikari Shinwa Palutena no Kagami, roughly translating to English as Myth of Light, Palutena's Mirror. Hikari Shinwa's main character was a winged angel named Pit, or Pito in Japanese. While many assume Pit was based off of Icarus from the famous Greek tale, it's more likely his design was inspired directly by either Cupid, the winged Roman god of affection and desire, pronounced as Cupido in Japan, or Puto, an Italian word that refers to a chubby male child, usually portrayed with wings, that often represents a cherub or angel. Pit was tasked with rescuing the goddess of light, Palutena, or Palutena in English, whose name was likely based on the Greek goddess Athena, pronounced Atena in Japanese. Athena's full title sometimes included the epithets Pallas or Parthenos, reading as Parasu Atena or Palutenos Atena in Japanese, with Palutena potentially being a portmanteau of the two titles. Coincidentally, a mobile suit named Parasu Atene, obviously also inspired by Athena's name, was introduced in the popular mecha anime Zeta Gundam, airing from 1985 to 1986, which also could have provided additional inspiration for Osawa. The main antagonist of the game, who had imprisoned Palutena, was Medusa, one of the 3 Gorgon creatures from Greek mythology, who was depicted as a female with snakes in place of hair. Any who gazed into her eyes would be turned to stone. Medusa not only locked Palutena away, but also stole the 3 sacred treasures: the Arrow of Light, the Wings of Pegasus, and the Mirror Shield, which most likely inspired the game's title, Palutena's Mirror. Once development had wrapped up on Metroid in late July of 1986, much of its team took short vacations before moving over to work on Hikari Shinwa in August. Many of Nintendo's finest, like Yoshio Sakamoto, Satoru Okada, Makoto Kano, and even composer Hirokazu or Hip Tanaka would assist Osawa with completion of the project. Similar to its R&D1 predecessor, Metroid, the game would be a 2D platformer with an emphasis on shooting that featured both horizontal and vertical scrolling levels and included a save system. Unlike Metroid, however, Hikari Shinwa asked players to work their way through 12 different stages, split into 3 separate worlds: the Underworld, the Overworld, and the Skyworld. The Underworld and Skyworld sections required Pit to ascend up various platforms vertically while the screen scrolled with him. If he fell down between any of the platforms, the screen would not scroll back down with him, and he would instead tumble to his demise. This led to some of the team jokingly referring to Hikari Shinwa as a quote-unquote falling game. If Pit moved horizontally past the edge of the screen in these levels, he would loop back around to the opposite side, much like Pac-Man or the original Mario Bros. Arcade game. The 4th stage of each of these 3 worlds would not be linear at all and mimicked the dungeons found in The Legend of Zelda. Pit needed to navigate his way through each of these winding maze-like fortresses, eventually confronting a boss at the end who was guarding one of the stolen sacred treasures. Throughout these areas, Pit's comrades, or centurions as they were called, who had been turned to stone by Medusa, could be cured of their ailment using the hammer items found in the normal stages, and would aid the player when confronting the fortress's boss. The game's 13th and final stage saw Pit equip the 3 sacred treasures he had recovered and take to the air with his newfound power of flight. Rather than another platforming level, this final segment featured gameplay that resembled a shooter, similar to Gradius or Defender. Osawa wanted the finale of the game to catch the player off guard and introduce a very different type of gameplay. As development continued to move forward, Hikari Shinwa slowly began to change from having a serious tone to one that was more lighthearted and humorous. Medusa's army of monsters that filled the game's stages probably best exemplified this tonal shift. The Megane Hanan enemy, translating literally to Glasses Nose, and known in English as the Speck Nose, was jokingly modeled after the title's sound composer Hirokazu Tanaka, who the team teased about having a very large nose. The Kometo enemy was obviously a nod to the Metroid species found in their namesake game, which many of Hikari Shinwa's staff had developed. Their name is presumably a shortening of Kometoroido, which translates roughly to English as Little Metroid or Child Metroid. The Shinigami enemy, known as the Reaper in English, was a foe that wandered slowly back and forth on a platform. If Pit walked into the Reaper's line of sight, menacing music would play, and the enemy would start to quickly flail about while summoning flying minions to wage an all-out attack on the player. And finally, there was the title's most notorious enemy, the Eggplant Wizard, who could transform Pit into a helpless walking eggplant, incapable of attacking until he visited a special hospital room that removed the curse. These bizarre foes were inspired both from the Eggplant Men found in Nintendo's earlier Wrecking Crew game, as well as Osawa's strange passion for the fruit. It's a fruit, not a vegetable. Who knew? The humorous tone also was conveyed when Pit died during a stage. Japanese text would appear on the game over screen with the winged hero exclaiming "Yarare-chatta," meaning roughly "I've been killed," and implying a sense of embarrassment. This mildly broke the fourth wall and reaffirmed the game's sillier tone. As development progressed, the workdays became longer and longer and the weather got colder and colder. Much of R&D1's staff would regularly end up laboring away late into the night on Hikari Shinwa, with many opting to sleep at the office, often on broken down cardboard boxes, braving the crippling cold, which would steadily creep into the building once the heat shut off at the end of normal business hours. Osawa even got married partway through the game's production, but with the grueling schedule it demanded, he had to give up on any hope of a honeymoon and spent the majority of his time slaving away at Nintendo's headquarters, far from his newly wedded wife. Despite the rough working conditions, development continued on. As things moved forward, additional aspects were added to the game, such as hearts, which acted as the currency the Pit could collect and use to purchase items from shopkeeper rooms, like bottles that restored health and a feather which saved him from falling to his demise. The humorous tone injected into the game was made even more readily apparent with two other game features. A credit card item that let Pit, a winged, ancient Greek-inspired warrior, use a plastic card to purchase things from certain shops, even if he couldn't afford them. As he continued on his quest, all hearts he collected would instead go to paying off his credit card debt before he could acquire more. Players also could haggle with shops by yelling into the Famicom's built-in microphone of the second controller. The shopkeepers would either raise or lower their prices depending on certain factors. Probably one of Osawa's biggest goals when designing Hikari Shinwa was to implement RPG-like elements into the gameplay to help set it apart from other titles in the same genre. Pit would steadily grow in power, both offensively and defensively, as he made his way through each stage. The more enemies he defeated, the higher his score would grow. Once the score reached certain thresholds between stages, he would level up, increasing his survivability so that he was able to take more damage. As Pit took out enemies, collected items, and even took damage, a second hidden score would increase and decrease in the background. If this score was high enough when entering certain rooms, Pit would receive an upgrade to his arrow strength, allowing him to deal more damage when attacking. He could also increase his offensive capabilities by completing challenge rooms. These areas would throw a barrage of enemies at Pit. If he was able to survive the onslaught for a certain amount of time, he would be rewarded with new abilities, including fire arrows, longer shots, and a protective barrier, though each ability required a certain amount of health to activate. Pit's offensive and defensive levels, along with his heart currency, amount of deaths, and weapon collection rate, all affected exactly which of the game's 5 separate endings the player would see after defeating Medusa. These ranged from Pit transforming into a speck-nose enemy to becoming a fully grown adult. Hikari Shinwa didn't quite reinvent the formula of the platformer genre in the same way Metroid did, but it still certainly innovated on it, adding in permanent RPG-inspired upgrades, a currency system complete with shops and credit cards, and a variety of different stage types. Once December of 1986 rolled around, the game's mid-month release date set by Nintendo was quickly approaching. It became very clear that some of Osawa's additional ideas for the project would have to be scrapped. Even then, the team pressed on, narrowly managing to finish up development on December 16th, just 3 days before the title's release date. Thankfully, the disc cards could be written relatively fast for a quick turnaround on production. Hikari Shinwa Palutena no Kagami hit Japanese store shelves for the Famicom Disk System on December 19, 1986 for the price of 2,600 yen. Popular gaming magazine Famitsu gave it somewhat mediocre ratings, scoring it 27 points out of a possible 40, but the game still received good coverage and even managed to rank number 5 on the publication's top 30 games list. Hikari Shinwa performed fairly well sales-wise, managing to sell around 1 million copies in Japan, roughly the same amount as Metroid, though it was very clear it would not reach the massive popularity of games like Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. As time moved on, the Famicom Disk System's retail success and popularity slowly died off, as the capabilities of cartridge games started to improve drastically with the addition of battery backup saves and additional storage space. The disk system's infamously unreliable hardware and long loading times also hastened its eventual demise and discontinuation just a few years after its launch. Thankfully, Hikari Shinwa would not meet the same fate and experienced renewed life in the West. The game would make its way to North America and Europe the following year in 1987 for the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, under a brand new title, Kid Icarus. This name once more pulled inspiration from Greek mythology, specifically the tale of Icarus and Daedalus. Since the Famicom disk system was never released outside of Japan, Kid Icarus would obviously need to be ported over to a standard NES cartridge. While built-in batteries that allowed players to save and then continue where they left off were present in some NES games, starting with the Western release of The Legend of Zelda, a password system was created for many other Famicom disk system ports. This would emulate the save feature found in many disc card titles, though it was a bit more inconvenient, requiring players to constantly write down a long string of letters and numbers every time they reached a stopping point. Kid Icarus's February 1987 North American release would be the very first of Nintendo's disk system ports to utilize the feature, with the title being branded as a password pack. The developers had an extra few months for the game's Western debut to implement not only the aforementioned password system, but also a few other additions. The final shooter-inspired stage now scrolled to the right automatically in Kid Icarus, instead of the player having to manually move the screen forward like in the Japanese version. At the end of the level, when Pit defeated Medusa, she could now be seen transforming back into her human form. The worst of the 5 possible endings in the Japanese version, where Pit transformed into a Speck-Nose enemy, was removed and replaced with a new best ending with additional art and animations where Palutena gave a fully grown Pit a kiss on the cheek. After each ending, a new credits sequence was added that listed all of the developers who had worked on the game, though as was common at the time, the names were all pseudonyms. The haggling mechanic remained intact, but without the microphone controller functionality that the Famicom had. Players now had to push the A and B buttons on the NES's second player controller to activate it. And finally, the title's Game Over screen was changed from Yararechata in Japanese to I'm finished in English text. Kid Icarus performed well in the West, becoming a hit for Nintendo and establishing a passionate yet somewhat niche fanbase. In the years since, Kid Icarus received numerous ports on Nintendo consoles and handhelds, including the Game Boy Advance, the Nintendo Wii's Virtual Console, Nintendo Switch Online, and the NES Classic. A remake of the title under the 3D Classics line was developed for the 3DS by Arika and released in 2012. Development on an unofficial fan remake made in Adobe Flash by Flip Industries titled Super Kid Icarus began in 2011, but sadly never came close to reaching completion, with support on Flash eventually being discontinued. As for Osawa, after tirelessly crafting Pit's 8-bit adventure, he continued working at Nintendo for many decades, assisting with key franchises like The Legend of Zelda and Metroid. Over the next few years, Kid Icarus further solidified its role as a prominent game, with Pit making various cameo appearances in other Nintendo titles like Tetris and F1 Race. Additionally, the young angel also starred in the 1989 DiC Entertainment cartoon series Captain N, the Game Master. The Western TV show would oddly change Pit's name to Kid Icarus, alter his appearance quite a bit, and add quote-unquote Icus to the end of all his dialogue.
My arrows will stop that Apicus Maximus!
The series' infamous eggplant wizard also appeared regularly in the show as one of its primary antagonists. Pit's Nintendo cameos and starring role in Captain N proved the game had established a strong foothold and become a key title for Nintendo of America. Given this popularity, it wouldn't take too long for a sequel to enter development. However, Pit's next adventure would not be found on televisions or home consoles, but instead on a portable screen. In 1989, Nintendo launched their handheld gaming console, the Game Boy, to much success and acclaim, fueled by entertaining titles such as Tetris and Super Mario Land, along with a cheaper price point and superior battery life. The Game Boy was able to triumph over its other portable gaming competitors around the world. While Nintendo relied heavily on third-party publishers to bolster the Game Boy's library throughout its lifespan, they also created plenty of their own games, often reworking successful Famicom and NES titles for the handheld. Super Mario Bros., Balloon Fight, and F1 Racing received spin-offs, sequels, and ports for the Game Boy, as did Kid Icarus. Pit's handheld adventure debuted in 1991, 2 years after the Game Boy's initial release, titled Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters. very little is known about the exact development process and staff members involved in the series' next chapter, outside of R&D1 creating it and Tosei Software providing assistance. The only two confirmed developers at this point are Nintendo's Masafumi Sakashita, who worked as a designer on the project, and Tosei Software's Hideo Kawaguchi, who helped with programming. Whether or not key R&D1 members from the original game were involved at all, like Toru Osawa or Yoshio Sakamoto, remains unclear, though Osawa would work as a tester on Metroid's sequel, which was developed alongside the game, linking the two series together once more. Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters wasn't a mere port or remake of the first title, but it did follow the exact same formula and stage progression. Pit would need to traverse through 3 different worlds, each consisting of 3 normal platformer stages followed by a fortress section and a boss, ultimately culminating in a final level featuring similar gameplay to the shooter-inspired stage of its predecessor, where Pit would once again equip the 3 sacred treasures and gain the ability to fly. Even though on the surface, this sequel seemingly copied its predecessor from start to finish, that didn't mean it wouldn't bring anything new to the table. While some familiar foes did return, Of Myths and Monsters introduced plenty of new enemies and bosses. Orcos, who replaced Medusa as the game's main antagonist, was likely inspired by either the Roman mythological underworld deity Orcus, or the daemon known as Horkos or Horcus in Greek, that is said to punish those who break their sworn oaths and pledges. He was portrayed in-game as a horned, demon-esque monster intent on destroying the land. Rather than Palutena being kidnapped again, the game instead revolved around Pit training to become stronger, while gathering up the 3 sacred treasures to prepare for Orcos' prophesied attack. One of the biggest changes in the game was that the screen would now scroll up and down and left and right, following Pit's movements, giving players more freedom to explore each stage and backtrack to a certain room or area if they desired. This feature also made the vertical levels much more forgiving than in the first game. Given the Game Boy's lower pixel resolution, the screen was zoomed in on Pit quite a bit more than its home console predecessor, which almost made the levels feel a bit larger and more expansive, even though they were pretty much the same size. Additionally, Pit could now use his wings to float down more slowly if the player continuously pressed the jump button while descending, allowing for smoother landings and easier platforming. The hammers returned once more, but could now uncover hidden doors in addition to breaking the fortress's centurion statues. This time, though, the statues merely rewarded Pit with items, rather than assisting him during boss fights. Finally, one of the biggest quality of life changes was that some of the game's mechanics were now far less obtuse. Oftentimes, the characters in the various rooms explained how certain weapons and items functioned, while also sometimes giving hints where certain hidden doors might be found. This put far less of a focus on needing the instruction manual or a strategy guide to understand many of the game's basics, which were much harder to uncover in the original title. Shopkeepers now also refreshed their inventory while Pit was in the room, making it easier to find specific items rather than having to wait for another shop. Over the years, many have assumed that Kid Icarus and Metroid on the Famicom/NES used much of the same programming code, with plenty also suspecting that Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters and Metroid 2 Return of Samus shared this same trait. While these claims are unsubstantiated, they're also far from illogical. Both sequels were developed alongside each other at Nintendo R&D1. Both shared similar jumping and shooting physics, and both first released in November of 1991 for the Game Boy in North America. There was one big difference between the two, however. While Metroid 2 saw a release in Japan just 2 months later, Kid Icarus' sequel remained exclusive to Western territories, launching in Europe a few months after its November 1991 North American release. The reasoning for this decision is unknown, especially since the game performed fairly well sales-wise in its native country on the Famicom Disk System. The game even leaned into its Western predecessor's Kid Icarus title by presenting a humorous image of Pit near the sun with his wings falling off after completing the final stage. No doubt a nod to the Greek mythology tale of Icarus flying too close to the sun and his wings of wax melting, plunging him to his doom. of Myths and Monsters would eventually receive a single re-release in 2012 digitally on the 3DS eShop. The re-release would not be exclusive to the West this time, however, and also launched on the Japan storefront, marking the first and only time it would be officially playable in its native country. After Kid Icarus' 1991 sequel, the series went completely dormant for quite some time. 5 years later, in 1996, though, magazines reported on a 32-meg Super Kid Icarus for the Super NES in development, with rumors suggesting that it would be announced at that year's E3 event. But the game never actually materialized, either being cancelled or never having existed in the first place. It did, however, inspire the short-lived Flash-based fan project of the same name. Kid Icarus and Metroid's connection would continue in 1997, when publications reported on rumors that development was well underway for both Kid Icarus 64 and Metroid 64. The latter was later confirmed to have never made it out of the early concept stages, as the team wasn't confident that they could make a quality follow-up game on Nintendo's 64-bit console. Details on Kid Icarus 64, on the other hand, never emerged. It's quite possible the project either never existed or, much like Metroid 64, was shelved during early planning stages. Regardless, neither project ever saw the light of day. 7 years later, in 2004, the Kid Icarus rumor mill began to swirl once again, this time via gaming website IGN. In 2002, Capcom announced an action-adventure GameCube exclusive project to be released in the summer of 2003 titled Dead Phoenix, which featured an emphasis on both shooting and flight. Gaming website GameSpot confirmed its cancellation from Capcom in mid-2003. The following year, however, IGN reported that Capcom's official statement on Dead Phoenix's fate was still to be determined. The website also pointed to rumors circulating that suggested the project was being reworked into a new Kid Icarus game. These rumors were pure, unsubstantiated speculation and based more on the fact that Nintendo had been allowing many third-party developers to work on some of their key first-party franchises than anything else. When Dead Phoenix's producer, Atsushi Inaba, was asked about the status of the project, he gave a very cryptic response, suggesting that the game perhaps had been repurposed for a different franchise. While this certainly didn't confirm the Kid Icarus rumor, it did make it seem like more of a possibility. Regardless, neither Dead Phoenix nor a repurposed version of the project were ever released, and the title was quietly cancelled by Capcom. The series would receive a new release in 2004, but not quite in the way fans hoped. The original 1986 Famicom Disk System game received a port for the Game Boy Advance that year, but strangely it was exclusive to Japan. This port retained its original name, Hikari Shinwa Palutena no Kagami, and was published under Nintendo's Famicom mini-series of classic games. This decision was even more bizarre considering its handheld sequel had been exclusive to Western regions, skipping Japan entirely. Additionally, Kid Icarus had one other 2004 appearance as well, making a cameo as a microgame in WarioWare Twisted on the Game Boy Advance. By this point, things were looking grim for Kid Icarus fans. Since 1991, its sister series, Metroid, had managed to receive a Game Boy Advance port of the NES game, a duo of mainline 2D entries, a fresh start with Metroid Prime on the GameCube, and even Metroid Zero Mission, a complete reimagining of the very first title. Meanwhile, Kid Icarus had received nothing outside of a few vague rumors that went nowhere, a small cameo appearance, and a handheld port of the first game that left out fans not living in Japan. Once thought to be a series with wings, Kid Icarus had now fallen to depths of obscurity. Everything would change just a few years later, when the winged hero finally made his triumphant return once more, though not exactly in the way fans were expecting. By 2007, Kid Icarus had been relegated to the darkness of obscurity. With only unsubstantiated rumors and occasional hints to sustain them, most Kid Icarus fans had given up hope on ever seeing the franchise return. And then, on May 25th, 2007, the darkness finally gave way, and Nintendo shined a beam of light on something real, something substantial. Pit was announced as a playable character, complete with a fresh new redesign for the upcoming Nintendo Wii exclusive Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Brawl would be directed by Masahiro Sakurai, who had not only created the first two Smash Bros. Games while working at development studio HAL Laboratory, but also designed Nintendo's popular Kirby character and directed many of the prominent Pink Heroes games. Sakurai left HAL and Nintendo in 2003 and formed his own company in 2005 called Sora. At Sora, he took on game development projects assisting as a private contractor. During E3 of 2005, Satoru Iwata, Sakurai's previous boss from HAL and the president of Nintendo at the time, approached him about directing the next entry in the Super Smash Bros. Franchise for Nintendo's incredibly successful Wii console. Sakurai accepted the job. Sakurai played many of Nintendo's Famicom Disk System games back in 1986, but Hikari Shinwa, Palutena no Kagami had stood out to him due to its silliness and more lighthearted nature when compared to Zelda and Metroid's more serious tone. With Sakurai directing Super Smash Bros. Brawl, he had an opportunity to pull the winged hero out of retirement and even give him a fresh coat of paint. There was just one problem. Pit's design hadn't had the chance to naturally evolve over the past 2 decades in the same way that characters like Link, Mario, and Samus had been reworked through multiple sequels. Sakurai and his team had to imagine what that evolution might look like when modernizing Pit for Brawl. The primary goal was to make his new design stand out while staying true to the core essence of the character. Something Sakurai thought would be important not only to fans, but also for the approval of his original creator, Toru Osawa. His design wasn't the only thing that changed. Pit also received a new type of bow weapon that split apart into dual blades in a final smash attack where Palutena appeared and summoned an onslaught of Centurions against Pit's foes. After Super Smash Bros. Brawl released in 2008, many began to wonder if the Kid Icarus franchise was finally primed to make its triumphant return. Over the next year or two at press events like E3, Western journalists would regularly inquire to Sakurai about the possibility of a new game now that Pit had been reintroduced after so many dormant years. Behind the scenes, though, a new Kid Icarus project had already begun the early stages of production, though it was not the same game that would actually see a release a few years later. In March of 2007, a few months before Pit was unveiled for Super Smash Bros. Brawl, Nintendo approached Factor 5, the talented studio known best for their work on the Star Wars Rogue Squadron series, about the possibility of reviving the Kid Icarus series for the Nintendo Wii. Factor 5's experience with flying and shooting games made them an obvious choice to tackle the franchise. This new project, codenamed Icarus, went through many different concepts, especially when it came to Pit's design. Nintendo wanted the studio to keep the character's look more in line with his new Smash Bros. Design, even going so far as to provide 3D models and assets for Factor 5 to utilize and reference. The team working on this new project, however, decided to ignore these requests and go with an older, more mature-looking Pit. When it came to gameplay, a prototype was created in Factor 5's in-house engine for the Wii, which utilized much of the same tech found in their most recent project, 2007's Lair for the PlayStation 3. The prototype had the player control Pit's flight movement with the Wii's nunchuck analog stick, while using the Wii remote to aim and shoot. After spending roughly a year working on the project, Nintendo decided that things weren't going in the right direction and pulled the plug on it in 2008. The exact reason for the cancellation isn't quite clear, but there's speculation that Factor 5's decision to not utilize Nintendo's new design for Pit was probably a pretty big component. After Brawl's release in 2008, Satoru Iwata approached Sakurai once more to inquire about the possibility of hiring the veteran director for a new project. Iwata had 2 requests, however. One, he wanted it to be an original game, something quite different from simply another Super Smash Bros. Entry. And 2, it needed to be a project that's something the in-house development team would not be interested in making. Iwata revealed to Sakurai that work had begun on a successor to Nintendo's wildly popular DS, and that this new portable hardware would have a strong focus on 3D graphics, offering this as a possible avenue for his new project. Sakurai was intrigued and accepted Iwata's proposition. he figured there would already be plenty of casual-focused titles released for the 3DS, given how its predecessor had managed to pull in a larger, more mainstream audience, so he decided to create a quote-unquote solid game for gamers. Sakurai decided early on that he wanted this new project to be a third-person shooting game with both air and land battles. After this decision, he began to think about whether it might be possible to revive a dormant Nintendo franchise that could utilize this type of gameplay. One series in particular fit this concept quite well: Kid Icarus. Well, not at first. Initially, Sakurai had considered Star Fox as a viable series for his shooting project, but as he thought about it more, he realized he might be too restricted in implementing the type of quick movement and shooting he had envisioned in a Star Fox game. Eventually, he decided that the Kid Icarus series would be perfect for the type of gameplay he had in mind. To tackle development, a new first-party studio called Project Sora was created in early 2009, with Nintendo as the majority stakeholder owning 72% of the studio and Sakurai's Sora owning the remaining 28%. Project Sora would continue recruiting many new staff members in the coming months as development on the new project started to ramp up. This 3DS exclusive would be titled Kid Icarus Uprising in the West and Shin Hikari Shinwa Palutena no Kagami, or roughly New Myth of Light Palutena's Mirror, in Japan. Development on Uprising got off to a rocky start, with the team at Project Sora unable to acquire any 3DS dev kits. Instead, they were forced to begin creating the game on PCs, and even utilized the Nintendo Wii for development during the project's early stages. Just like Sakurai's initial concept, the majority of the game's levels were broken up into two parts: a flying rail shooter segment and an on-foot ground-based section, with more up-close and personal combat encounters, generally culminating in a boss battle. In Uprising, Pit was able to fly for just 5 minutes at a time using Palutena's magic, which necessitated him landing to complete the second half of each level on foot. While many assumed Sakurai's inspiration for this type of gameplay was pulled from Nintendo's Star Fox and Sin and Punishment franchises, this was not true at all. He actually took some nods from Sega's arcade hit Space Harrier instead. Kid Icarus Uprising started off with both a very familiar plot and a recognizable cast of characters for fans of the series. Medusa was revived years after her defeat in the first game, with Pit and Palutena working once more to bring about her defeat while facing off against plenty of familiar foes. As the story progressed, however, countless new characters were introduced, helping the game establish its own unique identity. Keeping in theme with the previous Kid Icarus games, the majority of these newcomers like Hades, Viridi, and Phosphora were either inspired by or directly named after Greek mythology deities, though some of their names differed between the Western and Japanese versions. The development team went to great lengths to pay tribute to its predecessor in plenty of fun and amusing ways. Sakurai and Project Sora regularly referenced the first game with pieces of sprite art, some of its original chip-based music, and even utilizing the same "I'm finished" game over screen. Strangely, Uprising seemed to retcon the Game Boy sequel, making no mention of or reference to its characters or events. Palutena acted as both Pit and the player's guide, explaining certain game mechanics and how to properly control and maneuver themselves throughout each level. Pit, Palutena, and the large cast of characters would regularly banter amongst one another as the player made their way through each stage, helping to deepen the world's lore and progress the story. Sakurai painstakingly wrote out the entire scenario and script by himself, constantly trying to place Pit and the cast of diverse characters into a variety of different and interesting situations. He strived to maintain the sillier, more humorous tone of the first title, and to ensure this, characters would regularly break the fourth wall during conversations, making playful jokes about real-world objects and even referencing many other Nintendo games. The Kid Icarus series continued its connection with the Metroid franchise in Uprising by once more including the Kometo enemies, who Pit even directly calls Metroids.
Kometo's look an awful lot like little Metroids.
No! Stop right there!
Hey, what's your problem?
This game universe and that game universe have nothing to do with each other.
Additionally, space pirates appeared during the story, which Pit must confront and defeat, yet another Metroid reference. Sakurai's biggest goal when creating Kid Icarus Uprising was to give players as much freedom of choice and versatility throughout the game as he possibly could. This was conveyed in many different ways. The first was the Fiend's Cauldron. Before each stage, players could wager hearts, the game's currency, to increase the overall difficulty of the level on a scale from 0 to 9. As the difficulty increased, the amount of hearts they'd receive for completing the level became larger and larger. If they lost a life though, the hearts they wagered would be lost, and the difficulty level decreased a bit. This introduced a unique risk-reward system where experienced players could gamble big on their skills with more challenging intensities, and more casual players could stay on the safe side with the lower difficulties. The second example was the game's vast selection of weapons players could choose from. Pit could equip 9 different weapon types, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, including blades, staffs, claws, bows, palms, clubs, cannons, orbitars, and arms. These could be purchased with hearts discovered in stages, created from fusing 2 weapons together, or gained from special gems received using the 3DS's Street Pass feature. Each weapon would vary in power and rarity. Countless special abilities, or powers as the game called them, could be found and equipped alongside these weapons to give Pit an added advantage during the ground stages. Each power had a different shape and would need to be maneuvered to fit on a special grid-like board alongside other powers. These ranged from specialized movement abilities and health recovery to enhanced weapon attacks and added status effects. In addition to the weapons and powers, Uprising featured plenty of other unlockables attained from completing certain challenges in specific game modes, like a collection of special 3D models called idols, various artwork portraits, and a variety of music tracks written and arranged by a massive all-star cast of video game composers, including Motoi Sakuraba of Dark Souls fame, Yasunori Mitsuru, known best for his work on the Chrono series, Yuzo Koshiro, composer for the Streets of Rage and Ys series, and Masafumi Takada, composer of Danganronpa. While the majority of the soundtrack consisted of original compositions, there were also many tracks based on Hirokazu Tanaka's music from the first game. Finally, Uprising gave players the ability to choose from various customizable control options. While its control scheme was probably the title's most divisive trait, Sakurai ensured the players could customize it at will. The game defaulted to using the 3DS's circle pad to move Pit around, and its touchpad to aim and maneuver the camera, but these controls could be shuffled even to the D-pad and face buttons to tailor them to whatever felt more comfortable for the player. The game was also one of the few compatible with the 3DS's short-lived Circle Pad Pro accessory, though Sakurai and his team had to scramble to implement its functionality, as they only learned about its existence after Nintendo themselves had unveiled it to the public just months before Uprising's release. The Circle Pad Pro made the game more accessible for left-handed players, but unfortunately did not allow right-handed players to aim with it. In addition to the single-player campaign, Uprising featured a multiplayer mode that let up to 6 players face off against each other, either locally or online. Around this time, many people were skeptical of multiplayer modes as they often were simply tacked on towards the end of development by studios to satisfy publishers. But Uprising's multiplayer had been planned from the start by Sakurai, who had worked immensely hard to perfect it and considered it just as important to the overall experience of the game as the single-player story. Players could face off either in team battles called Light vs. Dark or free-for-all matches. Participants could earn weapons, abilities, and hearts in each mode. Similar to the single-player campaign, a risk-reward system was implemented, where players could choose to bring in rarer, more powerful gear, but if they died, whoever defeated them would be rewarded by receiving additional points and doing more damage to the opposing team's life bar in the Light vs. Dark mode. Kid Icarus Uprising launched worldwide in March of 2012 on Nintendo's 3DS. It came bundled with a special stand for the 3DS to help make controlling the game more comfortable, and 6 random AR cards which could be scanned using the handheld's camera to unlock special in-game collectible idols. The full collection consisted of more than 400 different AR cards, which could be acquired through purchasable booster packs, as well as from Club Nintendo, official strategy guides, retailer-exclusive promotions, magazines, special events, and even bundled with soundtracks and action figures. Collecting the full set was no simple task. Uprising received mostly positive reviews from critics. Popular Japanese gaming magazine Famitsu was so impressed, in fact, that they gave the game a perfect score, an honor they'd bestowed very rarely in the publication's 2.5 decades it was in print. Reviewers who were less enthusiastic about the game all generally complained about the title's difficult controls, particularly during its on-foot segments. Regardless, most who criticized the control scheme still agreed that the game's actual content and presentation were quite good. The 3D Classics remake of the original Kid Icarus released in early 2012 on the 3DS, most likely as a way to help build excitement for Uprising and potentially introduce more players to the original game, which was referenced pretty frequently in Pit's newest adventure. In North America, the remake was even given away as a pre-order bonus for purchasing Kid Icarus Uprising. Uprising performed quite well sales-wise in the months following its launch, managing to sell more than 1 million copies within its first year on the market. While some people were not exactly thrilled with Uprising's control scheme, it still went on to become quite successful and helped push 3DS hardware during its bumpy early years. Since Kid Icarus Uprising's release, Pit showed up in 2014's NES Remix 2 and also became a mainstay in the Super Smash Bros. Franchise, appearing in both the Wii U and 3DS iterations, as well as Super Smash Bros. Ultimate on the Nintendo Switch. Palutena and Dark Pit were also introduced as playable characters, giving the Kid Icarus series a firm representation in Nintendo's popular fighting franchise. However, not even the relative success of Uprising nor Pit's renewed popularity have proven enough to guarantee another game in the franchise. There have been no new entries for over a decade now, with the series once again laying dormant. In late 2022, Sakurai himself expressed interest during one of his YouTube videos in seeing Uprising make a return, stating,
新パルテナ、強気ゲームとしてやりたいですよね。どこかがペロッと移植してくれないかな。
Whether this was Sakurai making an earnest request to Nintendo or simply teasing a project already in development is anyone's guess. But at this point in time, Uprising on the Nintendo 3DS remains the most recent game in the Kid Icarus series. Whether Pit, Palutena, and the rest of the unique cast of characters will return for a new chapter in the near future, or if Kid Icarus will be doomed to yet another 2-decade hiatus, is still up in the air. For now, though, the 3 games in the franchise continue to provide entertainment and a few good laughs for those who still play and enjoy them even today. Hey, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed learning about the history of the Kid Icarus series, one of the most near and dear series to my heart, one that I've been playing for a very long time. I want to give a huge shout out to Rob, aka Mr. Matthews on YouTube, for collaborating on this project with me and splitting the video editing duties on this. He did an amazing job. He does great work on YouTube. There is a link for his channel down in the description, so check him out, drop him a sub, look at some of his videos. There's also a bonus video of us talking about some of the facts that didn't make it into the script, so that'll be pretty cool, and we talk about our experiences with the series a bit too. So thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.